Ever thought about, what it would really take to nudge the needle on healthy aging, maybe even lifespan?
It's the big question, isn't it?
Right. And what if the answer wasn't some super complex therapy, but maybe just cutting back on one specific nutrient in your diet? It sounds kind of simple, but there are some pretty remarkable animal studies pointing in that direction.
It does sound almost too simple, I agree.
Yeah.
But the science, looking at how specific nutrients, especially individual amino acids, interact with aging, well, it's a really dynamic field right now.
Totally. And the nutrient we're zeroing in on today is methionine. That's Methionine.
Pronounced methionine.
Exactly, methionine. So our dip dive today is really sparked by a recent mouse study highlighted on lifespan.io that builds on earlier work. We want to understand if restricting this amino acid could genuinely improve health markers linked to aging.
And crucially, whether it holds clues for maybe extending health span or perhaps even lifespan down the line.
Yeah.
So our mission here is to unpack this research for you. We'll explore what methionine actually is, why we need it, then really get into what this latest mouse study found.
And why it might work, biologically speaking.
Yes, the mechanisms, and then of course the big one. What, if anything, does this actually mean for you?
I find this fascinating because it shows how, specific molecules from food might interact with these really fundamental aging processes. The potential impact is, well, it's pretty striking, even if it's mostly animal models for now.
Absolutely. And those animal results are exciting. They drive the research forward. But we definitely need a balanced view.
For sure.
We'll look at the findings, but also, the nuances, the challenges in translating this stuff from mice to humans. It's not a straight line from a lab study to changing your diet tomorrow.
Definitely not. Okay, so let's start with the basics. To even talk about restricting methionine, we need to know what it actually is.
Right. So at its core, methionine is an essential amino acid, and it contains sulfur.
Essential
Meaning our bodies just can't make it, period. We have to get it from the food we eat. It's non-negotiable.
Got it. So what's its job? Why is it so essential?
Well, it does a lot. It's a basic building block for making proteins, think muscle, tissue repair, all that. It's also really important for something called DNA methylation. That's a process that kind of helps control which genes are turned on or off. Super important for cell function.
Okay.
And it's a key ingredient for making important antioxidants like glutathione. That's part of our body's defense squad against cell damage.
Right, the protective stuff. And where do we typically find it in our diet?
Generally speaking, animal proteins are the big sources. Meat, eggs, dairy, fish. They tend to be quite high in methionine.
And plants.
Most plant proteins usually have lower levels. There are exceptions, though, like Brazil nuts and sesame seeds are relatively high for plant sources. But overall, the balance shifts.
So the idea, the hypothesis here, is that maybe in typical Western diets, which often lean heavy on animal protein, maybe we're getting too much methionine, an excess that could potentially speed up aging.
That's exactly the line of thinking researchers are pursuing. The idea is that a chronic high intake might nudge the aging process along faster.
How? What would be the mechanism?
Well, a couple of ideas. It could increase oxidative stress, sort of like cellular rusting, or it might overactivate certain pathways in our cells that sense nutrients, pathways linked to growth.
Okay.
These growth pathways are great when you're young, but maybe keeping them cranked up high all the time isn't ideal later in life, possibly contributing to age-related diseases.
Which brings us neatly to this new mouse study you mentioned. How did they actually test this? What was the setup?
It was a controlled experiment. They took mice and split them into two main groups.
Okay.
The control group got a pretty standard mouse diet with a 0.86% methionine. The other group, the experimental group, got a diet where methionine was significantly cut back down to only 0.17%.
Now, this is crucial. Were they also eating fewer calories overall? Because we know calorie restriction itself has huge effects.
Excellent point. And no, they specifically controlled for that. Both groups ate the exact same number of calories. So this design really let them isolate the effects of just the methionine reduction, separating it out from general calorie restriction effects.
Smart. And how long did this go on for?
The study ran for 6 months, and they started when the mice were basically young adults.
Okay, same calories, way less methionine for one group. This is the exciting part, what happened. What did they actually find in those low methionine mice?
The results were quite compelling, yeah. The mice on the restricted diet showed clear improvements in several markers of healthy aging.
Like what?
Well, they had better frailty scores. They were just physically more robust. Their neuromuscular coordination, balance and movement control was better.
Which often declines with age.
Exactly. They also had a healthier body composition, less fat mass compared to the control mice, and importantly, at a deeper level, they showed fewer pathological signs linked to age-related diseases.
Wow. And this wasn't completely unexpected, right? This fits with older research.
Precisely. These findings really back up earlier, quite landmark, studies in rodents on methionine restriction. Some of that previous work, I mean, it showed truly remarkable results.
Oh, remarkable.
We're talking lifespan extension of potentially up to 45% in some of those rodent models.
45% in mammals. That's huge.
It's a staggering figure, even accounting for differences between mice and humans. Seeing these health span improvements in the new study alongside that historical lifespan data is what makes this whole area so compelling.
Okay, 45% lifespan. Mind-boggling. But let's put the exact number aside for a second. Why might this work? What are the leading theories on the biology?
There are a few key ideas, and they probably work together. One is reducing oxidative stress, like we mentioned. Less methionine might mean fewer damaging molecules, these reactive oxygen species bouncing around inside cells. Less wear and tear over time.
Okay, protection. What else?
It also seems to change the way the body handles sulfur amino acids more generally. This could positively affect those methylation cycles, kind of like fine-tuning gene activity and maybe boost cellular housekeeping and repair processes.
Right, better maintenance. And you mentioned nutrient sensing before.
Yes, that seems key. A major player appears to be the mTOR signaling pathway.
Ah, mTOR, yeah. Comes up a lot in aging research.
It does. It's a central regulator of cell growth and metabolism. And just like calorie restriction, cutting back on methionine seems to dial down mTOR activity.
So shifting focus.
Exactly. Shifting the cell's priorities away from constant growth towards more maintenance, repair, and stress resistance. That shift is thought to be a big reason why things like calorie restriction and potentially methionine restriction show these benefits for aging and longevity in various species.
The study also did something clever with a drug called nitisinone, right? What was that about?
Ah, yes, that was a nice piece of experimental work. Nitisinone is a drug that blocks an enzyme involved in breaking down another amino acid, tyrosine.
Okay, so they messed with tyrosine metabolism on purpose.
They did, in some of the mice. The reason was to check something specific. Were the benefits they saw really just from lowering methionine? Or could they be maybe a side effect? Like maybe restricting methionine changes tyrosine levels and that's what's causing the good effects.
Ah, trying to isolate the cause. Clever. What did they find out?
The results using nitisinone pointed pretty strongly to methionine restriction itself being the primary driver. The benefits weren't just an indirect consequence of altered tyrosine metabolism.
Okay, so it really seems to be about the methionine.
That's what this specific experiment suggested, yes. It helps solidify methionine restriction as the core factor behind the observed health improvements in this study.
So we've got these powerful results in mice, careful controls, supporting evidence. Now, the million-dollar question, what does this mean for us, for you, the listener? Can we just, start slashing methionine from our diets?
And this is where we really need to pump the brakes and add major caveats.
Right.
Translating these kinds of findings directly from lab mice to humans is, well, it's notoriously difficult. Our biology, our lifestyles, our genetic diversity, the sheer complexity of our diets, it's vastly different.
Makes total sense. But could our general dietary patterns maybe lean into this idea somewhat?
Potentially. The sources do mention that diets higher in plants tend to be naturally lower in methionine compared to diets heavy in animal products.
So moving towards more plants might offer some similar metabolic nudges.
It might. That's the idea. It could align directionally with what's seen in the mice, though again, you have those exceptions, the higher methionine plant foods. It's not a perfect overlay.
And would someone need to aim for the kind of extreme restriction seen in the mice?
Oh, almost certainly not. That would be incredibly hard to do consistently and probably not safe or advisable for humans. Methionine is essential, remember.
True.
The source material actually suggests that if this principle holds true for humans, maybe a strategy like intermittent restriction could be more feasible. Think maybe having specific low methionine days or periods rather than trying to maintain extreme restriction all the time.
Has anyone looked at this in humans at all? Even observational studies?
There are some observational studies out there, yes. They've looked at large groups of people, their dietary patterns, and their health outcomes over time. Some of these studies suggest a link, an association between lower methionine intake, often seen in the more plant-based diets, and potentially a lower risk of things like cardiovascular disease or certain cancers.
But that's just an association, right? Not proof of cause and effect.
Exactly. Correlation is not causation. We can't say definitively from that data that eating less methionine causes lower disease risk in people. There can be many other factors involved in those dietary patterns. We need much more direct human research.
Which brings us back to that critical point. Methionine is essential. We absolutely need it.
Cannot emphasize that enough. It's vital. Vital for growth, for tissue repair, for a functioning immune system, for making those crucial antioxidants like glutathione. Any talk of restriction must be balanced against these fundamental needs.
So trying to drastically cut it out could be actively harmful.
Yes, potentially very harmful, especially for certain groups: growing kids, pregnant or breastfeeding women, people recovering from illness or surgery, athletes needing high protein. Severe restriction could really compromise important bodily functions.
So the message is absolutely not cut out methionine.
Definitely not. The source is clear. Any significant dietary change inspired by this kind of research really needs to be discussed with a doctor or a registered dietitian. No DIY extreme diets based on mouse studies.
Okay, let's try to summarize then. What's the main takeaway from this deep dive?
I'd say methionine restriction is a really exciting active area in aging science. This latest mouse study adds solid evidence that lowering methionine separate from just cutting calories can improve health markers and even extend lifespan, at least in these animal models.
But the big caveat remains.
The human translation. That's still very much unknown territory. Whether these findings apply to us, how they apply, to what degree, that requires a lot more research. We're just not there yet in terms of specific recommendations for people.
So while we wait for that science to unfold, is there any practical thought or direction we can take from this?
I think so. While extreme restriction is clearly off the table, the research does kind of align with broader nutritional advice, suggesting benefits from shifting towards a more plant-forward way of eating.
How so?
While focusing on dietary patterns, rich in fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, which tend to be naturally lower in methionine, though not devoid of it, and moderating intake of high methionine animal products. That's a practical, lower-risk approach. It potentially captures some of the metabolic spirit of the research without the dangers of severe targeted restriction. It's about balance, diversity, and moderation.
That feels like a sensible place to land for now, grounded in the possibilities, but also the current realities.
Exactly. It acknowledges the intriguing science while respecting the essential nature of the nutrient and the gaps in our knowledge for humans.
You know, this whole discussion about methionine brings up a really interesting paradox for you, the listener, to think about. We've hammered home that methionine is absolutely essential for life right now, for growth, repair, immunity.
Indispensable for immediate health.
Right. But then, this research strongly suggests that getting less of it, restricting it, promotes longevity and better health span, at least in other species. So what does this apparent conflict tell us? How does the body balance needing something essential for today's survival versus potentially benefiting from less of it for tomorrow's longevity?
That's a fascinating tension.
It really is. How do we reconcile needing enough for immediate function with the possibility that less might be better long term? Does the meaning of essential change across our lifespan, or depending on whether we're prioritizing short-term needs versus long-term health goals? It's something profound to consider about balance, needs, and how you approach your own health journey over time.